So with your permission, Sam, it's lovely to be here again. We were here a couple of weeks ago. This time, 2 weeks ago, we started the first of our 3 conversations on this book here, which we've been discussing, God's Unfailing Word, a book put out by the Church of England with an introduction by the Archbishop of Canterbury and afterward by the Chief Rabbi. And it discusses theological and practical perspectives on Christian-Jewish relations. And they are 3 conversations which broadly cover the 6 chapters in this book, and we were going to cover them 2 chapters at a time at each evening. The chapters we discussed 2 weeks ago were a difficult history, the beginnings of how Judaism was continuing and how Christianity started and evolved, and the distinctive relationship that created, both with its challenges and opportunities possibly, but in the very early stages of our history, very much challenge was the much larger word which we grappled with a couple of weeks ago. This week we're covering 2 no less controversial and challenging topics. The first one being mission and evangelism, and the second one being teaching and preaching. And next, in 2 weeks' time, on the 4th of July, we'll be back at my home in Marble Arch, and we'll be discussing the land of Israel and ethical discernment and common action. So a number of things we're going to do just for some housekeeping. First of all, the chat function is open, so please put your comments in the chat, any questions you wish to ask in the chat, and we have with us Ben Sheridan, we have also Jonathan Evans, who is online as well, and they'll be curating or looking at all these questions, keeping track, and towards the end, we will look at some of the questions that have been asked, as well as I think some that have been asked beforehand, and we'll try and answer those as we go. And also the idea of, or basically just to get into those subjects, and we'll get started. So Sam, great. I'll let you start. This is your home, and housekeeping out the way.
Yes. The third chapter which we're going to look at today is about mission and evangelism. And mission for Christians, I tend to divide things in simple terms. Discipleship is me and God. Ministry is me and the church, and mission is me and the world. And of course, the world is quite complex. It includes the ecological issues very much in today's focus. It includes issues around social justice and our simple working lives and our engagement in the world and our working lives. And it does traditionally include evangelism. So that's clearly the pointed issue. The chapter begins with the 5 marks of mission as they've been known for the last 30, 35 years or so. Not restricted to Anglicanism by any means, but quite an ecumenical statement. And those refer to the things that I've just referred to, really. And there's only one of them that really, the first one is proclaiming the good news. And the second one is, I think, teaching, baptizing, and I can't remember what the other third, and nurturing new believers. So obviously the flashpoint there is baptizing. So I think we should talk a little bit about to what extent evangelism is integral to Christianity, and to what extent Anglicans, since this is an Anglican document, think or should think that converting people, proselytizing as it's sometimes called, bringing Jews to faith in Christ is essential to being a Christian disciple, I guess. So I guess that's the question. Shall I attempt an answer to that, or is there anything you want to say?
Well, I'll open actually. What you said was really nice. You said there's almost 3 concentric circles. There's you, between you and yourself, you and your God, you and God, or you and your fellow man.
So the church. So I think discipleship is me and God. The church is ministry is me and the church, and mission is me and the world.
Right. So there are some parallels in Judaism. We have 2 broad areas and fields of activity. One is known as Ben Adam Lamakom, which basically means between man and God. And broadly, if you take, for example, the 10 Commandments, the first 5 commandments as written or as depicted on these 2 tablets of stone, the right-hand side are the first. Obviously, we're going from right to left, so the right-hand side is the first column. And that would be between man and God. I'm the Lord your God, no other gods before me, no name in vain. And then keeping the Sabbath and honouring your parents are between man and God.
Yeah, that's what I'd call discipleship.
Right. And then the second half are ben adam lechavero, which means between man and his fellow. So there's two ideas that we have, these two sort of these compatible or parallel relationships, how I'm interacting with God on a constant basis and how I'm interacting with my fellow man. And the interesting part, obviously, is that number 5, honor thy father and thy mother, sits in the man and God element, which goes back to some of the things we originally said, that if we are behaving appropriately in relationships, then we invite God into those relationships and we sanctify them thereby. So that's interesting. So I like that parallel. We do have different things. And then there's another idea which isn't necessarily talked about classically, but there's ben adam la'atzmo, which means between man and himself. In other words, a sense of introspection. We've got work to do on ourselves, really, before we try and go out for others. That's almost Jordan Peterson's idea.
Yeah. Well, I see that as still part of discipleship. When I wrote a book called Incarnational Ministry, it included those notions. It was being with God, obviously, in prayer, but it was also being with yourself. And I actually put being with creation in terms of discipleship, because creation is inanimate. So your as in my understanding, creation is given that we should worship. And so rather than as a project, which putting under mission would put it. Anyway, we should come back to the flashpoint of evangelism.
So there are 5, as you said. The first, proclaiming good news. The second, teaching, baptizing, and nurturing. The third, responding to human need, which we can talk about later. The fourth, seeking to challenge unjust structures, which we're both comfortable with. And the fifth, striving to safeguard the integrity of creation.
Yeah, so those third, fourth, and fifth would be in that territory of social justice and ecology, and mission, understood in the broad sense of meeting people's needs. So tikkun olam, I guess, would be your term in terms of repairing the world.
Very much. But it does come back to number 2.
It comes back to number 2. So what does that mean? Well, again, I think that I had 3 responses to this, and I'd be interested in your take on the 3 responses. So the first is the same answer I gave last time we talked a couple of weeks ago, which is to say, I don't think of Jews as being an other faith. I think of you and your fellow Jews as being my parent, out of which Christianity is always the child, as I understand it, and Judaism is always the parent. So, there are some categories in the book of where you feel you belong, in terms of whether Jews are simply like people of no faith, or in other words, ripe for conversion, as it were, all the way through to Jews are already there, and it's they who need to teach the Christians, or at the other end of the spectrum.
Right, so the 4 responses.
So I think I would then nuance things again on a second level, and say I think my own understanding and an understanding of a church like St. Martin's might be at odds with some parts of the church, in the sense that in a post-colonial context, the connection between evangelism and colonizing people and cultures, is actually quite strong. In Tom Holland's book Dominion, which I enjoyed reading last year, he has a wonderful quotation from an Indian scholar in the 19th century who said, as far as I can make out, Christians are people who go all over the world into other people's countries and try to turn them into versions of themselves. And I think, Christianity has to put its hand up, certainly in the last 200 or 300 years, and say there's been an awful lot of that. Oscar Wilde has a wonderful phrase about selfishness, that selfishness is not wanting to have everything for yourself, it's wanting everyone to be like you.
Yeah.
And that's, I continue to, I wrote about that in my book, The Future Bigger Than the Past, and that's a very challenging. So those are all very challenging lines to Christians, to say, what is really going on in evangelism? Are we wanting a person to come to the full enjoyment of God and God's enjoyment of them? Or are we wanting people to become very much like ourselves? And there's been an awful lot of the second. So again, the reason for going into this much detail about it is that I think the heart searching for Christians is not really primarily about Jews. I think there's heart searching about evangelism in general. And it'd be interesting to have your views on how Judaism approaches sharing its convictions with others. So we talk a lot at St. Martin's and in Hart Edge about what we call asset-based approaches. In other words, starting with what somebody already believes, subscribes to, where their talents, skills, gifts, interests, and passions lie, and building on those. And so that can never be more true than it is true of relationship with Judaism. So does that rule out longing for, praying for, working for, persuading others to share your convictions? I'm not going to say it rules it out, but I'm going to say it's done in the context of really wanting to enjoy their convictions as they currently are. And a conversation like the ones we've already had, where you go into the conversation expecting both parties to learn and to grow, rather than to defend a corner and want to become the winner. So I think if you're approaching the conversation in that state of mind, then you're in a completely different kind of conversation. But the point I'm making is that should be true for Christians with anybody, not just with Jews. But obviously there are sensitivities with Jews that make that even more true. So I think the whole way the question is set up, which is that, oh yes, we know normally Christians are in the business of making everybody into versions of themselves, but they have to be a bit careful with Jews, I think is, I would challenge that whole way it's set up. And then the third thing I'd have to say is simply put, and again, I'd be interested in your views on this. I just think the Holocaust is just such a scar on history that even though Christians can try to wriggle out of it and say, well, Nazis weren't Christians and it wasn't done by Christians, I think that's a real stretch. So a friend of mine, who was actually my external examiner for my PhD, he did an essay for a book that I edited 25 years ago. But it stayed with me, that essay. He wrote the essay about the church that was just on the edge of Dachau. It was just a stone's throw from the camp, right by from the fence you could throw a stone to the church. And it was just a very poignant essay where he wrote about, I wonder what the people who worshipped in that church on a Sunday were doing for the rest of the week. And to me, that made the point better than anything else I've read. Obviously, we talked last time about the history of anti-Semitism going back into the Middle Ages and beyond. It's the elements in the scripture, which we might talk about later. Yeah. But to make the point that you cannot extricate Christianity, authentic Christianity, i.e. people worshipping in a church in the 1940s, from the people that were doing the ghastly things in the Holocaust. You can't disentangle them. And so I think it's going to be 200 years before Christians can relate to Jews as if, without that being kind of like the overwhelming fact about both of our lives. So the idea that we can simply evangelize Jews as if the Holocaust wasn't just 75 years ago, I think is just absurd. So those would be my three responses.
Well, that's quite an opening. I think, well, let's try and look at a couple of them in different ways. First of all, the idea of proselytizing. So I think you may know that Jews are not non-proselytizing religion. In fact, so much so, the halakha, the code of Jewish law, defines those who wish to enter the Jewish faith are in fact pushed away. That's the default position, is that it's literally to say you really don't want this, because if you really do, you have no idea what it brings with it. The enormity of we feel responsibility. This idea of this notion of a chosen people is not a sense of superiority in any shape or form. It's chosen for immense responsibility for the delivery of a message to the end of time, and that's where there may be a sense of parallel, maybe with Christianity. But to the point where, if we go into an open conversation, and this is what I'm really enjoying about these conversations, is I don't quite know where it's going to go. I know where my faith lies. I'm looking to have it challenged and broadly expanded through the things that you're saying, but I'm also not concerned or worried that I'll walk out of here thinking, or maybe I've bet on the wrong horse, which is a really interesting approach as well. So it's not that I'm closed-minded, it's that I really have a deep-seated sense that what I espouse and what I believe and how I go about my belief is intact and comfortable and where it should be. As you said, as a parent, it's interesting. Would I have my children try to teach me things that I need to know because I'm older and therefore I need to know how new things happen? Or am I genuinely comfortable that I bring with me the parent's sense of tradition that I believe is still intact, and apropos the ideas of the covenant, of the Old Testament, which is how you describe it, the Bible, the Hebrew Bible as we would. So that sense is interesting, that we're not proselytizing, we're not looking to change anybody. When I have a conversation with you, I'm not walking away thinking, I didn't bring you back to Judaism. Whereas you may be walking away from the conversation as, did I open up Daniel's eyes to maybe things he hadn't seen before, such that he may have an interest in pursuing further down that line? And that's an obvious element that has to be in the room, just in terms of, as you said, the church's mission, and that you felt that a sense of failure of the church was that it had to use a stick and some difficult physical persecution to convince people of its message. And if it was eloquent enough, then surely the message should be convincing of itself. And almost the persecution for me is almost a reassurance for me that my message is so intact that the word does not take me over to where you would like to see from an missionizing, from an evangelizing point of view, Jews to be. That's the first part. So proselytizing very much not a part of Orthodox or Judaism per se. The second part also of this idea of everybody ultimately coming into faith through Jesus. The idea that, and if you don't do that, it's a binary state of being. Either you are or you aren't. And that goes back to fascinating ideas about life, about pregnancy, about the fetus as opposed to the mother. Which one? Where are the focuses? From Judaism's point of view, it's the mother over the fetus. The fetus actually, in certain elements, from a theological perspective, does not have a personality in terms of that, or a statement to make up to a certain point, because the person who's here in life is the person who would be protected. The person in potentia has different types of protections, obviously medical, physical protections, but in terms of its theology, it hasn't made its case yet, so it doesn't start the conversation. That's interesting from that perspective of how we come to understanding our case. And another part which I think is interesting very much is the notion that I'm not looking to find a single way to truth. In other words, Judaism believes in truth for truth's sake. And therefore, if you want to come at truth from multiple angles, that's your prerogative. And that fits beautifully with the idea that we don't proselytize because we don't believe that we have a monopoly on a truth that you would need to absorb or take in order to tick all the boxes that we need. We have a particular faith and a particular approach to it. We also have a universal approach, and one is not the sense of the other. So at the end of one of our prayers, the Aleinu prayer, which is the last prayer we finish all of our services, morning, afternoon, evening services, and it comes from our High Holy Days, is the idea of, on that day, the day at the end of time, by Yom Havu, on that day, Yihya Hashem Echad, God will be one, Ushmo Echad, and his name will be one. It doesn't say on that day, everyone will be Jewish. We don't believe that at the end of time, everyone will be Jewish. At the end of time, everyone will believe in one God. Are there multiple paths to that? Absolutely. So I have not even no problem. I have no worries about having wonderful conversations, because I would love it if you felt closer to the faith that you're espousing, and I'm closer to the faith that I'm espousing, and we're having a dialogue to help each other understand our own positions, as well as, I'd like very much, as I said to you earlier, to understand more about your position, because it is fascinating, but from a faith perspective, not from a sense of lack, from my perspective. And the last part, which is interesting, is the notion I feel that, and again, I'd love to hear more from you about this, is that as Christianity was evolving from its earliest moments, it was looking to expand through, Christendom was looking to expand through Europe. It was bringing in many pagan rituals and incorporating them into its practice, such that rituals towards the end of the year, around Christmas time, had their existing elements. Well, we have a wonderful midrash of Adam, who is in the Garden of Eden, and he's seeing the days starting to shorten, and he's worried that it's going to actually go all the way down to zero. It's not an asymptote, it's a direct line. And as a result of that, his time is limited because there'll be no more daylight. And then slowly the days obviously start to lengthen after the winter equinox. So at around that time, the end of December, as he sees the days getting longer, he naturally makes a festival. And so there's a festival that's embedded into the fabric of the season, such that many religions pull in that time of the year as something that really is a time of light. So although Hanukkah happens to happen around that time of light, so a festival of lights, that's also another element. There's Saturnalia, which was not pretty for the Jews all the way through history, and we'll leave that for now. People can look it up if they wish. But other aspects and other faiths, and therefore Christmas itself has a sense that it's incorporating that notion of what's happening anyway at the end of the year, bringing it into the sort of the theological perspective of where Christianity is. And so Christianity has been absorbing customs and adapting them or bringing them into Christianity. So it's looking to, as I say, bring everybody into this single truth, whereas I'm very comfortable with everybody holding on to their particular truths with the universal notion of reaching God. So on the basis of all that, then my question still comes back to you, the notion of baptism, the idea of some form of immersion in water. Why, firstly, that is what it is, especially for our Jewish friends who are watching. I'm not sure exactly who's on this evening, but it'd be interesting to find out why that is the key moment. That's one of the elements of a form of conversion. And also, from my perspective, why you would need to make that final step. What are we glad?
Yeah, so baptism, it's interesting. While you were talking about the kind of the drawbacks of being Jewish and why you might having a nudge to people say, you really don't want to do this. It's interesting, that hasn't been stressed quite as much by Christians about baptism, but I think it should be, in a sense that the fundamental thing that's taking place in baptism is you are losing your individual identity. And you are being incorporated, but obviously the word comes from the word body, into the body of Christ, into a body that transcends time and space, the communion of saints, as it's sometimes described. And that's a thing that a lot of people don't really want to do. You know, it makes you part of something that isn't under your control. It goes against almost all the instincts of modernity, really, which are being so exposed by the pandemic, which are to be perpetually in control of your own destiny. And so things like martyrdom, even crucifixion, are, strictly speaking, for Christians, not a problem in the sense that you have already died in your baptism.
So you've given up your personal, as it were, agency.
Yes. Yeah.
For the good of
and
being embodied.
Yes, exactly. And that's not stressed because and my guess is it might be news to you because what is stressed is that you have passed, from death to life, and therefore you are now one of the saved, and therefore if you're Jewish you're not, because you haven't been baptized. That's only part of the understanding of baptism, but it's the part that's been waved in the face of Jews, no question, and of people of other faiths and no faith.
Well, it was a ritual that would define the before and after.
Exactly, but I think the problem then goes back to something I think I talked about. I can't remember if last time I quoted a prayer that means a lot to me, because it sums up a lot of what I want to say about this, which is that if I love you for hope of heaven, then deny me heaven. If I love you for fear of hell, then give me hell. But if I love you for thyself alone, then give me thyself alone. So what that means to me is it points out to Christians to what extent they've instrumentalized Jesus and God more generally as a way of dealing with the death problem and the eternal life option. And it challenges Christians to say, do you worship God in Christ for God's own sake, or because this is the best ladder to get you onto the ceiling, onto the roof? And I think the truth is that Christians have been quite happy to say, Jesus is the best ladder to get us onto the roof to deal with the eternal life problem. It's the impending death that has forced people. And so baptism has been stressed as something that accesses the roof. You see what I mean? It's the ladder that gets you to the roof. And
the key to eternal life, in a sense.
Yeah, exactly. And so people then go to Jesus's words at the Last Supper, "I am the way, the truth, and the life," and talk about them as if Jesus, the night before he dies, is making critical comments about religions, most of which haven't been invented yet, and how flawed they are, which is preposterous, as my father used to say. I mean, it's just absurd. The whole notion of Jesus spending his last night with the disciples doing that is just ridiculous.
Having heard everyone else, it doesn't sound particularly divine.
No, exactly. So, but I think we have to be honest and say that's how the tradition has been used. To me, baptism is fundamentally about being incorporated into a worldwide permanent body beyond yourself. And that's obviously still very, very significant, and it's still very challenging to Christian-Jewish relationships. But it isn't, to me, the point about that isn't as a stick to beat Jews with or a stick to beat non-Christians with. It's a wonderful gift to feel that you can give up your life to something much greater, and that you do that at a very early time in your life, possibly even as a baby, so that your whole life is lived not for yourself but for God. That's what the ritual means to me. Funnily enough, it may interest you, when I used to have a little church that had movable chairs rather than pews. I used to do baptisms entirely through the story of the Exodus. So we would start in Egypt on one side of the church, and then during the baptism itself, we would be in the Red Sea, and then after the baptism, we would be, the congregation would sit. They would actually physically move chairs, and then they would sit. Well, in the wilderness, the promised land, obviously at that point, the story gets a bit, you have to sort of speed up the story 40 years and you have to get to the promised land. So, but that made the point that story is still fundamentally a story of liberation, which is a story that Christians owe to Jews, that is perhaps the most significant story, along with the giving of the covenant in what we call the Old Testament. And that's where the water comes in, in the sense that it is a threshold, and then obviously the imagery of the River Jordan, where Jesus was baptized, obviously parallels the Red Sea. I mean, it does in the Joshua story and so on. There's clearly another crossing of the threshold. As I understand it, the crossing of the Jordan is a completion of the Exodus, in the sense that the first is a leaving of something, and the second is a coming into an inheritance. So all of that imagery is going on, and you can't understand baptism, it seems to me, without all that imagery, first of all from Exodus, and secondly from the book of Joshua.
So it is interesting what has come from all of this, and I am just trying to, I think, articulate or formulate this correctly from my perspective, is that the sense is that is it a fear of death that requires you to tick that box?
I think that's the heart of it.
Problem to start with, and then you can use the rest of your life to get on with it, in other words.
Well, I think the fear of death,
case,
the fear of death has been used as the single greatest instrument to frighten people into faith. I mean, that's why I quoted that prayer, because that's about take away all the faith that's about fear and just leave the faith that's about adoration and devotion.
So it's almost diametrically opposed to the Jewish view of death, or the Jewish view of life itself. The idea is that, well, if we're looking at sort of scripturally, if we're looking at sort of Deuteronomy 28, which is the litany of all the curses, and you have, if you don't keep the covenant which I have kept with you this day, then these things will befall you. And there is a list which is, it's absolutely frightening, to be perfectly honest. Just even in the literal sense, never mind the interpretive sense. But there's a verse in the middle which sort of is that breath of fresh air for me, which is one of my favorite verses in the Bible, which is, simcha u'v'tuv leivav merov kol, which basically means because you didn't serve God with a full heart, with gladness and joy from all of the goodness that you had received. In other words, through this whole list of basically the riot act, you get this moment saying, and it doesn't matter what you did in life. If you didn't have a sense of joy or appreciation for the gratitude you should have for everything you have, including all the challenges, including all I guess you could call it the suffering in a sense, but that word has slightly different meanings for both of us, then it's almost as if all of the actions that you did have no real value. In other words, the value comes from joy. So tick the boxes. I did this. I got up in the morning. I said my prayers. I put on my phylacteries. I said all the prayers. I washed my hands. I did all the things. Ate my food. Prayed in the evening. Went to bed. All of that stuff. If it was just because it's rote and I have to go through it with this drudgery, then it has almost no value. On the one hand, it does. There's a binary value. You did it. You can tick the boxes. You haven't missed a day. But if we're talking about the higher levels of appreciation of what it means to be faithful, there's that element. And that to me is interesting because the faith is not about a fear of death, I don't believe. I believe in Judaism, the idea is that you have, I have before you life and death. And God says, and you should choose life. And you choose life because that's the default position. It's not about a fear of death. In fact, it's about a love of life and joy of life, that this life is to be lived where it is, and the end of time is secure. If you live appropriately, there's no deals you have to make. There's no sense you have to take in order to guarantee that. It's always going to be an open choice. And I think that determinism of that if you go through baptism and that, as it were, ticks that box irreversibly, I don't know whether you can reverse yourself out of that and denounce and start again. So people do.
But you're never rebaptized.
You're never rebaptized.
Yeah, even if you renounce the faith, your baptism still, you just have to sort of put on the suit of clothes again.
I said Judaism is almost like the Hotel California syndrome. You can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave. And so that's right. And we've been taught that all the way through history. Even people who wanted to leave have been shown, sometimes under further persecution, that we actually don't believe you. Whether you're new Jews, new Christians in any way. So that is really interesting for me because the idea, again, given that the world is a corridor through which you prepare for the world to come, that's the default position. The world to come is the reward, and this world is about navigating your way through, which comes to the other idea that there are Jews who, without a belief in God, are still Jewish, which is a fundamental difference between us, Judaism, and Christianity. That it's not about, it is always about belief in God, but to come to a conclusion where you, for whatever reason, or whatever moment of doubt, you have an aberration in your sense of belief, doesn't divorce you from the Jewish faith that you're connected to.
And that's a big Reformation theme.
And that for me is why it's a sense of that there's no, I don't think there's a fear of death, really. I mean, if there's a fear of death, it's a physical fear, but it's not a spiritual or a faith-based fear, because we are actually excited for the life we have, challenged in the life we have, and if we orient ourselves correctly, then we do whatever we can for as long as we can to as many people as we can, and we've fulfilled our purpose. But within the Jewish faith, which requires, as we said a little bit, this gets into our teaching and preaching bit, maybe as a segue, is that from our perspective, and we spoke about this, the word Pharisee or Pharisaic Judaism, the idea that an orthodoxy in Judaism was about ritual, about performing all of these acts in a very specific way. And in fact, water is very much a connection to all of the things that we do. And even nowadays, I wash my hands in a certain way before I eat bread, and it's a certain amount, and it's very precise. I mean, you can talk about exactly how much, and they talked about there are sort of memes or jokes of rabbis in the old days with very large hands, if you're trying to measure how big things are. So some rabbis have a larger volume or a lesser volume, but the idea is that we have an ability to engage with death, and once we engage with death, we step away from our engagement with God. In other words, there's an idea of what we call tumah, or it's translated as impurity, but it's a wrong word. It's a distance that's put between us and God, and because death is a function of what happens sometimes in life. If you're called to bury somebody, then certain people cannot go into the cemetery still. The Kohanim, the priests, people who are received through tradition don't have that access. If we involved in creating and helping people to prepare for death, then I have to wash my hands in a certain way, and it's the engagement with water that connects me back to life. So water is always a sense of life. And I guess we're seeing it in the same way. But your idea of transition from Egypt through the water into freedom, or slavery through water into freedom, for us, water is always a sense of a reset as well. So there's a reset in everything we use with water. When we pour water on our hands, when we immerse ourselves in a ritual bath in a mikveh, the idea is to reset a spiritual status for the continuation of the same path. It's not about transitioning from another faith into the current faith. So I find that interesting that's the particular element that's used. So when Jesus is bathing in the Jordan, again, it's the reconnection to water, which is the inherent value of potential. Water is always potential because it exists in three forms. It can be steam, it can be water, it can be ice, and therefore when you're into it, you come out of it, it has potential to reset you in everything you do. And that's how we see water and how we see our engagement with water. So to use that water that we see as so sacred in the sense to reset and a path that we're still on, to take us out of that path and put us on another path, is why I think baptism is such a difficult ritual.
But John the Baptist, when he baptized Jesus, I mean, there wasn't any Christianity then. So this was a Jewish ritual of the kind that you're describing, a reset. Yeah, and that's the way it's presented in the Gospels.
But a reset for what?
Repent. Well, exactly. That's the
reset to what? And that's where we get into. But
so there's one thing I think before we move on to the teaching, because we haven't got too long. And the importance of the Reformation, I think this actually does make a good connection between the two chapters, but there isn't much about it in the book. I think it might have been mentioned a little bit in the first chapter, actually, we discussed last time. In Protestant polemic against Catholics, a lot of these anti-Jewish tropes come up in the Protestant polemic against Catholics. So, if you take the prodigal son story, which is mentioned, I think, in chapter 4, it has been exegeted as being the wayward Gentiles, going away as the prodigal son, the faithful Jews staying behind as the older brother, but God's kingdom being more readily taken up by the wayward Gentiles, the prodigal, and the unresolved nature of, as it is at the end of the parable of the prodigal son, where the welcome is there from God, come back to the party, but the story ends before you work out whether the elder brother receives that invitation. So that's been a classic way of understanding the relationship between Gentiles and Jews. However, in the Reformation, of course, it became the classic statement of the relationship between Protestants and Catholics. So most of the motifs that had been used historically about Jews were then by Protestants transferred onto Catholics, and that's where particularly you get this emphasis on the Pharisee as the person who's a rule keeper and who doesn't get the grace of the gospel. And again, this is very much a Protestant Reformation, 16th, 17th century rhetoric.
Because he's too detail oriented to appreciate.
Because it's the law. Yes, it's the law.
He's mired in the law, and there's no space for other things.
Yeah. So most, and some of them aren't particularly good fit for Catholicism, to be honest. But you can see how that kind of language in Galatians, for example, in the New Testament, is reinvented to be anti-Catholic polemic, and it's almost impossible to exaggerate how significant that is in terms of a whole new way of getting at Jews, frankly, but how that is somehow sacralized and transferred into becoming a way of getting at Catholics. So Catholics almost fill the slot that the Jews was already in, the clothes that were already made for the Jews in Christian polemic. And Protestants just use the same set of tropes on Catholics. So that that's relevant in terms of us moving to the teaching part, because when we move to the teaching part, there are really two elements there. I think there's the overt, explicit parts of most of all of the New Testament and to some extent of the liturgy that's come out of the tradition going back to the New Testament. And then there are the more subtle references, like the prodigal son parable, the way I've just read it together. So if we talk first of all about the overt parts, there is one line above all others that is profoundly problematic, and that is the line in the Passion narratives: "His blood be upon us and upon our children." That is, I think, that would make most Christians, certainly at a church like St Martin the Fields, wince when we read that story in the Passion narratives today, because it's kind of obvious how that has been used. It's been used to not only to blame Jews for Christ's death, but to say that Jews had actually called upon, actually asked for it. And
but does that line appear in all four of the Gospels?
No, it doesn't.
3 out of
it doesn't. I don't think it's even 3 out of 4. I think it's 1 out of the 4. I think it's just in John. So again, going back to the Pharisees thing, and I'll be interested for you to expand on what you just hinted at about the Pharisees there. I think there is a lot of anti-Pharisaic polemic from Jesus particularly in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And I understand that if you look at the time when the Gospels were written, just after 70 CE, just after the fall of the temple, or as some people think Mark was written a couple of years before, but very much about that time. It seems to me the Pharisees were the chief rival to Christianity. That's why you get that
Well, they were holding on to a very orthodox line,
yeah,
that required immense adherence to specifics, to ritual and to law keeping. And a lot of the narrative is about you can still have a path to God without necessarily taking on all of these elements of,
and also
ritual,
without attacking the Romans in quite the same way, that they weren't the zealots, they weren't the people that were. So I think that's part of the subtleties, that the Christians were not an overtly political, in the sense of revolutionary movement, and so they bore some quite significant similarities to the Pharisees. And so that anti-Pharisaic rhetoric is a bit like two parts of the Labour Party, making sure that you don't get the wrong one. I think there's something like that going on in the New Testament, and I don't think Christians need to be embarrassed about that. I think that's just recognizing we read a document in its historical setting. But then to make the jump to say that rabbinic Judaism came largely out of that Pharisaic tradition, and therefore it is explicitly condemned in the gospel, I think that's just a misreading of the text.
Well, I think rabbinic Judaism is evolving, and it's evolving a lot longer than the time that these texts are roughly set. It started before, it continues after. There's the Bar Kokhba revolt, and there are the whole areas to try and get a sense of where the Jews need to get to. And what happens is that the Mishnah, which is the code, the basic code of law, is being put down. It's being passed on orally, but it's written down in a form of sort of legal code.
Yeah.
It's closed around the year 300 of the Common Era, with the Talmud closing around the year 600. Although there are studies that say that there were tractates that were closed as late as 900 or 1000, but majority are comfortable with around 600. Of the Common Era. And what's happening in many of these, especially what I particularly remember about the Day of Atonement itself, an entire tractate devoted to that called Yoma, meaning a day, the day, some capital T, capital D. And what is being described is how to prepare the high priest for his ritual duties during the course of that day. And obviously, ritual duties are very precise. And there's a worry that he would interpret or take the rituals out of order. There's a certain very strict order that he has to do them, and he's being taught by the priests. The high priest obviously is just being inducted, and he has a week before the Day of Atonement, all the animals are passed before him, and he has to see who they are and see what's going on. And there's a very strict order of doing things, and especially when it comes to mixing the spices for the incense, which is going to take into the Holy of Holies at the climax of his work, his service, and there's the avodah. And it says that at a certain point in this, as it were, induction ceremony, or orientation ceremony, he turns away and cries, and the people who are teaching him turn away and cry. And they say, why are they both crying? He's crying because he can't believe that they suspect him of being a Sadducee. And they turn away because they're worried that if he doesn't do it according to the way that they proposed or interpreted, that he's going to die during the process. In other words, it will be not accepted by God. So it's a very strong, you can take it on all sorts of levels, political levels, religious levels, but the Pharisaic approach, the Perushim, right, from the word we said last time, the frosh is to separate. In other words, they are ascetic in some sense. They want things a certain way, very specifically. And if he doesn't do it that way, then they're worried that the Sadducean approach would actually mess with the fabric of what they're trying to ensure. And so at that point, very early on in this tractate, you have he turns away, he turns and cries, and they turn and cry. And they can't believe I can't believe we have to have this talk. In other words, this is how it's done. You know it, we know it, but we shouldn't have to say so. And so there is a sense very much at that point, quite early on, that there needs to be a way of doing things specifically, and the ritual is powerful and it's important. And so from a Jewish perspective, the Pharisaic approach is very much one that's going to maintain the law as closely as it can. And this comes all the way through time. So right across, we have then different denominations within Judaism that are branching off, and they're interpreting more broadly. They are, as it were, sometimes relinquishing some elements of the precise ritual for a more broad approach to Judaism. So Tikkun Olam, as we talked about, for example, is not the only way to approach it. It's the overarching idea, from my perspective and from an Orthodox perspective, having kept all of my rituals as intact as is possible from all the tradition that I have taken. So that, in a sense, from a Pharisaic perspective, is where I see the ability to survive over time is the adherence to ritual. And I think we've discussed, even before these discussions, we spoke about that Judaism keeps people Jewish because there's just so much to do. Yes. The idea that we haven't had a chance to speak to each other about, faiths, about the broader sort of conversations because we're too busy praying 3 times a day, taking our matzah, getting ready, the lulav and all of these things. And that's one aspect of it. So the ritual is one aspect, one part. The other part, if we're talking about teaching and preaching, is very much, we won't have time to get into this. We'll have to, maybe we'll pick it up next time a little bit. But broadly, there are doctrines of contempt. There are ways, as you said, of teaching a way that is intentionally skewing the religion and the interpretation away from Judaism in quite an aggressive and demeaning sense. And on the other side as well, not just the doctrines of contempt, but the notion of teaching that there is, as we said, we spoke about in the first, about the supersessionism, the idea that we have replaced, or Christianity is trying to constantly replace Judaism, and Judaism is just happy non-proselytizing to just go about its life and basically turns around.
So that would be the other text, I think, that would be
and more subtle. The blood libels coming out of that again. These stories that try to show that we are, as it were, demonic in a sense.
Yeah, those are obviously outside the scripture, but are very much to be found, quite commonly, and go on the centuries and centuries.
More than anything else. That's difficult for us.
But I just want to highlight one other difficult passage for Christians, which would be Mark 12, the parable of the vineyard, which is a story about how a landowner gave the land to tenants and then sent messengers to the tenants who were beaten and killed, finally said, I will send my son. And then the son was killed. And then the question is, what will the landowner do? The landowner will come and give the vineyard to others. And that's not really a parable, that's an allegory. And it's unmistakable. And it is the most problematic parable in this conversation. And it has been preached rather unthoughtfully, in a supersessionist kind of a way, the idea that Christians have displaced Jews. And I would say that slightly more subtle, and then the line from the Passion narrative, completely unsubtle, would be the two passages that I think Christians have to be very, very careful of. And then in the text, it also refers to some of the prayers that were historically said on Good Friday, again, coming out of the Passion narrative. So I think those are, frankly, really quite easily corrected. I think it's the exegesis of those two really problematic passages that Christians just need to be very, very careful with. We're all over our time for crossing over these questions. So
there is so much more to say.
There's a lot more to say.
I have to get into this, but for now, thank you.
Yeah. Let's see what comes up in the questions.
Dan.
Lovely. Thank you both very much. So we'll start with the question that we didn't get around to the last time we met, which is from Joanna Wood. Could something more be said about the earlier problems which Paul and others struggled with, such as circumcision and the food laws, which were a stumbling block at the time?
Well, I guess the problem that Paul is constantly facing is he's facing Gentile converts to Christianity, and the question is, do they need to become Jews in order to become Christians? And therefore,
so you need to go in to come out.
And the assumption was from the early church, the very earliest Christians, as reported in the New Testament, is that people did assume that. And then he is obviously finding great success converting Gentiles to Christianity who don't understand why they need to do that. And therefore, he goes to quite elaborate lengths to say, you don't need to do that. But then once you've done that, you then create a problem that you're basically junking Judaism altogether. You're saying it was a kind of a wrong turning in salvation history, and that's so much of the part of this conversation. Is if you, I actually think.
So had you stopped halfway, we would have had more Jews.
Well, yes. I mean, because I think for Peter, the way Peter is portrayed in the Old Testament, in the New Testament, is that's kind of what he wanted, and I just think we have to keep that as a live question rather than assume that Paul settled it once and for all. If the church was still asking itself that question as a live issue, I think a lot of the problems would actually go away, because the default would be that Jews have got it right. And the question is, how can Christians embrace, certainly the Tanakh tradition. Now, obviously, when we're getting into Mishnah and Talmud, we're into a whole other territory. But I think in answer to Joanna's question, I think it's about the whole mindset with which we approach things. And there, again, going back to that Protestant Reformation rhetoric, I think is so important. The emphasis on grace, the emphasis that we don't need any laws, we don't need any tradition, we just go straight to God through Christ. Has been rather thoughtlessly preached for centuries as being disrespectful of tradition, and most obviously disrespectful of Judaism, in a way that I don't think is what Paul was really saying.
But I think that in terms of what holds us in as Jews, I very much believe is a tremendous list of things to do on a constant basis.
Yeah.
And in other words, and I think it's almost in a way there's plenty of theology and plenty of thought and discussion, but we're so busy being Jewish, we don't have time to think about being anything else. And that's not just, yes, it's been criticized because for the people, and I guess Christianity in a sense was that there's too much detail.
Exactly.
Set aside all the detail. You don't have to worry about exactly how long you have to wait between eating meat and milk, and how you cut this and salt this and do that, and how many sacrifices you bring to the temple and what you do with them, and how you bury the blood and cut out the elements and what you do with all of these things. Just accept, and then we can talk. And when you can talk, there's not a lot you can say, and we feel. That's what we feel. But it is the actual the constant.
Yeah, no, I see that. But that's also an ongoing dialogue within Judaism today.
Absolutely.
So it's
very
not
much.
Just we need to take a couple more questions.
Yeah. So again, that is interesting. The dialogue is, and the question is, and the research, the Pew Research, for example, showing how many people are maintaining their faith on a constant, on an ongoing generational basis, and Orthodoxy is retaining and in fact growing, and some of the denominations are. Right. They're embracing people in a sense, but without a lot to do. When I say I worry about denominations, I do in general. I worry that without a lot to do, there's not a lot to hold on to or pass on.
Yeah.
And it's a lifetime of activity.
Ben.
Yes, Ben.
Okay, thank you very much. The next question is from Patrick. I understand that the LNU doesn't envisage that everyone will become Jewish, but does it not look to a time when all idolatry will be left behind and all acknowledge the God of Israel? Quite a strong, even binary truth claim.
That's one for you, right?
Yeah, I'm very comfortable with that. In other words, the idea that I said, quoted earlier, this idea of the end of the prayers, it was so powerful on the High Holy Days that this individual prayer called Aleinu, the Shabbat, it is upon us to thank and to show gratitude to God, ends with this idea that on that day, the day which is the end of time, describe it how you will, people will come to an understanding of a unified or a single God. How they come to it, from which angle, at what point, is the sense that there will not be any more idolatry. There's no sense that there are multiple ways. There's a unity, like a unity theory, a unified theory of everything. And you come at it from a Christian perspective, you come at it from a Muslim perspective, from a Taoist perspective, however you want to come at it from any time. But to understand that there's only one God, it all comes back to the pantheon falls away. Monotheism is not just, a cop-out, it's the actual way to correctly orient the world. So I have no problem with that. And you can do it any which way you like. Sam, on the other hand, has a preferred. All ways are good, but some ways are more good than others.
Well, but also I have problems with calling myself a monotheist because of the nature of the Trinity. So.
Yes.
Ben, one more.
Yeah, I think one last question.
I think this one leads quite well into it, actually. This is from Belinda. I would be interested in how you would connect the idea of water and life to Muslims who, in similar way, cleanse themselves before certain acts. Where do Jews and Christians stand / meet with Muslims in this conversation?
That's another one for you, I think.
It is very interesting. I think, again, it's just the notion of the idea of, you said, for example, the father versus the child. Judaism having predated both Islam and Christianity. Islam starts around the year 500, 548, something like that, around there, or 600. And so again, Medina, fascinatingly, at the time of Muhammad, I believe, was about 50% Jewish. And so a lot of the notion of what ritual would look like and what organized religion would look like was very much influenced by how Jews were practicing. And again, that notion in that area and at that time was very much about purity and other aspects. So there'd be a lot of water. And for example, on a practical level, there's the Gardens of Peace, which is a Muslim cemetery out in there. A couple of them. I think the one is out in Chigwell with Muhammad Omar, who's the lead cleric there. He's come to our cemeteries to see and to learn about how we do tahara, which is the washing of the body before we redress it in clothes which would simulate the clothes that the high priest would wear before burial. So there's very much a connection with that. There's a lot of washing of hands and feet before prayer in Islam. And also for Judaism, we don't wash our feet, but the high priest would, and it's all written in the Bible, especially in Leviticus. But primarily, we wash our hands before food, before prayer, waking up in the morning, seeing as that we see that sleep is almost a 60th of death. In other words, we need to get rid of these last vestiges of not being connected with our conscious selves. And water is the way we do that. So very much, I think, Islam and Judaism very much connected, but Islam learning, I believe, from Judaism and incorporating it into its practices, and Christianity as well, for that matter.
Yes, and you mentioned an interesting thing about Christmas absorbing other traditions, and I think if you look at the Christian sacraments, you've got water, you've got bread, you've got wine. I mean, you've got the very elemental things of life. And from a Christian point of view, those find their true purpose in the sacraments, because their true purpose is to bring us face to face with God. But I think what you said about Medina was new to me, and I think that's really fascinating. Have we got? I
think we're over time by a minute or two. So
yeah. So okay. Well, I'll wrap up because it's in my flat. Thank you very much for being with us for this conversation. Rabbi Daniel and I have been having a great time, and if you wanted to listen in, we're delighted about that, because we're going to be doing the same thing one more time, this time back at Rabbi Daniel's place. We wish we could have done it in person. That was what we were hoping for, but of course that hasn't turned out that way. But we will be discussing the state of Israel, or the land of Israel, as I think it's called in the document. That's obviously a hot button issue for Christians and for Jews and for many other people. But how to understand it theologically is obviously a very significant part of this conversation. So it's not the only thing we'll be talking about. We'll be also talking about how we can collaborate imaginatively on common issues. But I'm sure people will want to talk about Israel. It's not something that Christians and Jews talk face to face about very often. So it will be a very important opportunity. And I hope you'll join us in 2 weeks at the same time, 7 o'clock, on, I think, the first. Is it the first?
4th of July.
The 4th of July. The 4th of July.
Of course.
An interesting day to meet in its own way. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Thank you very much indeed. Good night.